recording. You have the notes. I thought there might be one or two brand new people, but I'm basically just gonna skip down through. I had already shortened the introduction in the Bible. John, are you trying to talk to us?
I was talking to my brother. He was half
Okay.
asleep, and we were talking to him.
Okay, just making sure. So I'm going to skip down through the Bible and interpretation because we have talked about that among us multiple times. And but just to remind all of us that we all come from different backgrounds, and that the reason I love this study is because we can share opinions and interpretations and learn from each other and be open to new ways of thinking. Okay. Go down to where it says Luke 1:1-4. And I'm going to, let's actually read that together. We're going to, in the future, at the bottom of the notes, it has what we're going to do next week. So like next week is Luke 1:5-2:52. So if you have time, read it ahead because we're not going to read all of it in here together. If you don't have time, still come. But we are going to read Luke 1:1-4 together. Does somebody have that pulled up and can read it?
I do.
Okay.
I'm reading from the NIV.
Okay.
Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too have decided to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught.
All right. So this is kind of called the prologue, or NIV, it says introduction. Different versions probably say something different, but this follows the normal form of historical and biographical works that were written around that time. This has the elements that were in things that were like outside of the Bible that were written. And so I wrote those here. The statement about the author's predecessors, I mean, he starts out with that. Many have undertaken the work's subject matter, author's name and qualifications. That's actually not there. The plan for this work, the purpose of the writing, and then the official addressee. So what is significant about that is that right from the beginning, we find out that Luke is a skilled writer. He has interviewed or listened to eyewitnesses, read other manuscripts. We know, so when you read this, it's going to read different than John. It's the same. It's about Jesus, obviously, but it's going to read different than John. This guy, Theophilus, we don't really know anything about him. Has anybody heard anything about him? Been taught anything about him in other studies?
Well, his name means person who loves God. So it could be the general audience, or it could be a specific person.
Okay. So the Theo, yeah, that's like theology. Philo, yeah, loves God. Cool. All right. Turn over to Luke at a glance. We'll go through all of this.
You know, the one thing I had heard about the Theophilus is that it's another indication that this was written to Gentiles because it was a very Gentile name.
Yes, I've heard that too.
Maybe because he was a protege of Paul and he was the apostle for the Gentile,
Mhm.
maybe.
Yeah. So I think I didn't really, let me look at the notes I gave y'all. I don't really think I deleted much. Thought we'd just talk through. You know, because sometimes I delete and I can't even remember what I did and didn't do. Yeah, I didn't delete anything. I normally do, so you can like fill in the blanks, but I didn't today. So you got it all here. So who wants to teach? Who wants to use my notes and teach? Okay, so authorship, first of all, most likely Luke. I mean, as with other gospels and books of the Bible, there's always debate about, so who was Luke? Was it really Luke? Maybe it was, you know, somebody just using the name Luke. This one, they're pretty sure that it's the Luke who was a physician and companion of Paul. There's multiple verses in Acts and then in Paul's writings that talk about this person Luke. So that he was a doctor and he was a companion of Paul. So he traveled some with Paul, the Apostle Paul. He was not an eyewitness. So if he traveled with Paul, that's after Jesus. So Luke did not know Jesus. So he used, and here, like in verse 2, it's talking about eyewitnesses. So he interviewed people, heard about Jesus. He also probably read Mark. The Gospel of Mark was most likely the first one. So he probably had access to that. He probably had access to other things written about Jesus that weren't actually put in the Bible. There's like things called, there's sources. It's like Q and I don't remember all the letters, but there were other scrolls found that weren't actually put in the Bible that have been found later. So Luke had access to all of that. So I'm not going to say a lot, but some of his book has some of the very same things that Mark has in it. It's written a little bit differently, but they're pretty sure scholars that he used Mark and other things. Y'all talked about him being a Gentile. So Luke, if it's the Luke that is described as being Paul's traveling companion, then that Luke was a Gentile. He was not a Jewish believer. He never was a Jew. He was a Gentile. So that would make him the only non-Jewish author in the New Testament, which is pretty significant. That so he didn't come, you know, all of them were Christians. All of the New Testament authors were Christians, but all the other ones came out of Jewish first. And so Luke, why do I keep saying Mark? Luke did not come out of a Jewish background, but he obviously knows the Old Testament, which is really interesting. So it's like he does a lot of quoting from the scriptures from the Old Testament. So it's like, we don't know if he got that from Mark or if he got that traveling with Paul. Like maybe he learned a lot from Paul about the Old Testament. But he puts Jesus in the context of the big plan of salvation and presents Jesus as fulfilling the Old Testament, which seems kind of strange that a Gentile would know how to do that. But he did.
That sounds like Paul.
Yeah, so you think, okay, well then maybe he really, really was Paul's companion and Paul just like taught him all kinds of stuff. And then it was written into Luke. So you can't really, I don't know where I was going to say with that. I kind of know what I want to say, but I have no idea how to say it. So I'm going to skip that. Luke, we saw in the way that he wrote the prologue that he is a skilled writer. He's a really good storyteller. So the Gospel of Luke is, in John, it kind of got, there were times where it's just like, what in the world is he even saying? Or didn't he already say this? Luke is a really good storyteller, so it's like really easy to read Luke, easier, and makes you kind of a page turner the way he writes. One interesting note, yes, Luke was a doctor, but doctors back then were not wealthy people. Doctors were part of the artisan class, not the upper class. So he was a working person. So, when we think, oh, a doctor, we usually think, oh, that's an upper class person, but he wasn't. It was in the artisan class positions.
So how educated was the artisan class?
Yeah, it's like it's blue collar or what
Yeah, I
is it?
think that's what they're saying. It's more blue. I think it's tradesmen. So like they would be educated in their trade. So like a
Stonemason.
yes, like a stonemason would know how to do stonework. However, a doctor obviously is reading and writing. Because he wrote this, and there's nothing in here that says he, like a scribe, wrote it for him. I mean, I guess that could be, but yeah.
Well, I've read that in the Greek and Roman world, doctors were often slaves. It was unusual. It was not unusual for a family to own its own doctor.
Ooh,
Yeah.
wow.
But slavery was very different in that world than it was from what we understand as slavery.
Right.
Slaves weren't kept ignorant, put in worse living conditions and so forth. They were could be well educated, and they had certain rights that we don't think of slaves as having, including the right to own slaves. A slave could own a slave.
That's cool. I mean,
Well,
not cool, but that's good to know.
I mean, being a physician may have been considered somewhat kind of dirty work. That you wouldn't want to get your hands, I mean, especially if someone had leprosy or it was feared that, it's not exactly something people would be racing to do.
Right, especially if they were Jewish and were trying to follow all these
All the cleansing laws.
Yeah.
And then, it wasn't that long ago that barbers were surgeons. So, I mean, sounds kind of strange, but it's really not that, it's not that unusual for a physician to be thought of as more of a servant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a servant. Yeah. So the date of events that happened in this book, it's obviously Jesus's ministry. So we're talking about the early 30s is when this is happening. The date of writing is going to be 70s to 80s. So it's between, if you remember Mark, I think we said John, when we studied John, we said like between 85 and 90. John was probably the last gospel written. Mark was probably the first one, like 50s or 60s. So Luke is somewhere in between there, but it's before all of Paul's letters circulated. Some of them I think were already being passed around, but it's situated kind of in the middle of everything. So Luke is a gospel, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all gospels, and it's one of the synoptic gospels, which means together seeing. And the synoptic ones are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So they have a lot of similar stories. They go in mostly the same order. There are some differences, but John reads completely different. than
John's is not in order.
No, John's is not in the same order, and it reads completely different. It only has, like, John only has 7 miracles in it. The other ones have a whole lot more. John, do you remember the purpose for John was that people would believe in Jesus? So a lot of stuff, the action stuff, was kind of left out. It wasn't so much just a record. Like, this is an orderly account. He's investigated everything and written an orderly account of Jesus. There are some things in Luke that are not included in the other gospels, so those are listed here. The Luke 2 is the Christmas story that's most often read. That you, when you hear the census, Caesar Augustus, that's going to be from Luke. The parable of the Good Samaritan is only in Luke. The story of Mary and Martha, like how Mary sat at Jesus' feet and Martha worked, that's only in Luke. Prodigal son is a Luke story. Zacchaeus is a Luke. And then when Jesus is on the cross and says, Father, forgive them, that's only in Luke. And the thief on the cross is only in Luke also. So a lot of the stories that were, the
Mhm.
most popular in a way are in Luke, not in the other ones. Which kind of goes back to the fact that he's a really good storyteller. So sometimes it's easier to read and be drawn in. Okay, some of the themes in Luke that we will see over and over again is the theme that salvation is for all people. That's probably because he was with Paul
With Paul, yeah.
and he was a Gentile. And so he is going to talk about salvation being for everybody, not just for the Jews. Luke really emphasizes Jesus' ministry to the poor and oppressed. We're going to read a lot about that. Women are included in Luke all over the place. Prayer is emphasized in Luke. Luke talks a lot about the Holy Spirit. Table fellowship, like Jesus eats. Jesus is like eating at all kinds of meals in Luke. It's really interesting. And so we'll be able to draw some stuff out of there too. The role of a disciple is talked about in Luke. So how John kind of had one, I mean, there were more than one theme in John, but it kept coming back to believe, 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 believe in John. Luke has a whole lot of different things that he touches on. So we're still going to ask the same questions every week for Luke that we did in John. We're going to try to see what does what we read that week tell us about who Jesus is, and then who are we to be in response to Jesus would be the second question. Okay. Anybody got stuff before we read that last paragraph about Luke that you've learned before, Luke in general, or something that you're hoping you're going to learn?
What just hit me, the Christmas story. I know we all probably know Luke's telling of the Christmas story by heart. We have that verse, Mary kept these things in her heart and pondered them. That's kind of a footnote. Luke, in carrying out his goal to research everything thoroughly, probably got those stories from Mary. And he's giving her a little footnote there.
Yeah. Did Luke know Mary?
Maybe since he wrote Acts 2, maybe the theme of the Holy Spirit being predominant in this book kind of carries through into Acts.
Yeah. A lot of this carries into Acts, like salvation for all people, Holy Spirit for sure, prayer.
Kind of ironic that you mentioned table fellowship being so important. And yet one of the things we can't do anymore is
Eat.
fellowship with people over a table. I mean,
Yes.
it just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And actually, when we did that at your house, whenever it was that we did that, that was just really a nice evening.
Yeah, that was the end of the year, the first year.
Yeah, it was like last summer. It was June or something. Because we were
It's been a
gonna eat
long time.
outside and then it rained. So we were like, okay, we're gonna be safe and we're gonna eat outside. And then we ended up having to all just sit in the family room together. But yeah, it felt like it was kind of safe then. Yeah, that is really, it is sad. Because I know for us, we stopped. I mean, we took the kids out to eat a couple of times, like November, December, and now we're like, nope, we're back to lockdown.
Takeout.
Yeah, we're back to takeout. You can't go sit in a restaurant and you can't eat with people that you're not, I mean, at least we aren't eating with people, like you said, that we're not around all the time. And because then you have to breathe on each other. And it's sad.
Well, and there's just so much about sharing food. You
Mhm.
know, you say a blessing together, you're sharing nourishment together. It's just such a basic way of caring about one another
Mhm.
that's missing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just a bundle of joy. Sorry.
That's why we're here, Paul, to support and encourage each other and say, you're not alone. We can see each other through the little screen. Maybe we should eat together during Bible study. That would be,
Join Julia. Sometimes that's the only time she gets to eat.
we can watch each other eat up close.
I'll bring mine every week.
Anything else that you learned about Luke before or that you're interested in? I know I just kind of putting you on the spot.
I guess I was just shocked that these stories that are only in Luke, I had assumed they were in some of the other gospels too.
Yeah, because
Just-
those are like prominent
Mm-hmm.
stories. It makes you wonder, like, how did they become such prominent stories if they're not in all of the gospels?
And then I'll start thinking about what is it about him and who he was and who he was writing to that made him include these when the others didn't. And I don't know if it's possible to answer that, but it's fascinating to me to look at what is and isn't in the different gospels.
Yeah, well, the Good Samaritan would go with the very first theme, that salvation is for all people. You know, we can probably match them up. I mean, Mary and Martha is about women.
And yeah, and then your priorities. All of them are.
Zacchaeus, I mean, that's like salvation is for all people, not just Jews and Gentiles, but like even the people who are,
Even short people.
yeah. Or even people that you would think there's no way, he's a tax collector, whatever. Yeah, that is interesting to think about. Why these included? Because you've also got to think, I mean, John wrote in John that Jesus did a whole lot more that wasn't written down.
Mhm.
But Luke, if he really interviewed a lot of people, read all the stuff, like how did he decide what went in here?
Maybe these stories kept coming up to people he interviewed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Who knows?
We will someday.
Yes, but will we really remember to ask that? Will we care?
Who knows?
It's hard to imagine eternity because we'll have all the time we would ever want to ask all the questions.
We probably won't have to ask because we'll already know.
Because
If
we'll
God
know,
wants
yeah.
us to see it, we'll see it,
Yeah,
That's
We'll
true.
Yeah.
Okay, can somebody, this is really small font to get it to fit on here, but can somebody read this big long paragraph I put on there? On the notes?
I'll read the first half.
Okay.
The study of the gospel according to Luke is a richly rewarding experience. Luke is a good storyteller and has the penetrating insight of a prophet. As a result, the gospel is engaging and offers a perspective on the redemptive events of Jesus' ministry. It continually calls the Christian community to model more fully Jesus' concern for the oppressed, the overlooked, and the outcast. The kingdom community is one in which the social barriers that divide and exclude are torn down, and God's grace can begin to flow to and among the wealthy and the poor, the sick and the self-righteous, the powerful and the excluded. The study and the teaching of such a gospel can serve to actualize in individuals and in congregations the redemptive purposes of God that guided Jesus' ministry and resulted in his death and resurrection. If the Spirit empowered the witness of this gospel, then by opening ourselves to it, we may also be guided by God's Spirit to be a part of God's ongoing redemptive work. The study of the gospel, therefore, calls us to see the sights and hear the words of Jesus' ministry as if we had been among the eyewitnesses, to grasp Luke's distinctive perspective on the person and work of Jesus, and to see the implications of the gospel for the times and circumstances in which we live.
Is there something in there that made you excited to study? Luke? Was there a line in there that stood out to you?
Well, if nobody else will talk, I will, of course. Um, I find it kind of interesting that he's not an eyewitness. It's in some ways a more like our position to be in, because none of us can be eyewitnesses. And sometimes I just think it would be such a different thing if you were an eyewitness. To believe would not be so hard if you saw the seas calm down. If but of course we haven't had that for thousands of years now. But it kind of makes him more like us in some ways.
Mhm.
Well, what stood out for me when I read this was that we're going to be, it continually calls the Christian community to model more fully Jesus' concern for the oppressed, overlooked, and outcast. That's where, I am in my life, is just feeling called, like specifically, to work for and with people who are oppressed, overlooked, and outcast. I had somebody this week send me something about, oh, you want to plant a church in Tuscaloosa? Here's all the ways that they do it. And I looked at it and I was like, no, that's not what I'm called to do right now. It was pretty and shiny and organized and, just like, no. And then the social barriers that divide and exclude being torn down.
But that is the church,
What
you're doing.
Yeah, I know. I call it traditional church ministry.
Okay.
But
I mean,
not.
I
That what
know.
I'm doing now, yeah, is church. Yeah, yes. But I have feel called to not be doing traditional church.
Right, in the
church
sanctuary, yeah.
Building. Yeah. Not that that's wrong, because we need it, and I'm still trying to find one, but, or many, but I personally know that I have been called out of that to serve in the community, which is scary. And this new little people's loan program job is the same. Gonna meet people who need help.
Well, in traditional church, you can always ask kind of, is this really right? Is what I'm being taught really right? Is this emphasis right? But I think when you're helping the poor or the oppressed, you can be pretty sure it's right.
Hmm.
I mean, the rest of the kind of details, it's pretty clear they are just the details. The mission is right.
Julie, were you gonna say something? Saw your camera unmute for a minute. All right. Well, that is just the little short introduction for Luke. Are all hearts clear?